We're going to get to Ben Burgess in a few minutes, but can you first give us a mini primer on Cheddi Jagan? Because I am fascinated by
many years
British
ago.
Guyanese
Many years
politician.
ago, and this has happened in so many of the so-called third world countries.
Right.
That at a certain moment, the people there have enough. They have enough of their poverty. They have enough of the corruption of the leaders that are paid by the colonial authorities. And so in British Guyana, it was a little country in Latin America that was a British colony. It was called British Guyana. Right next door was the Dutch Guyana and French Guyana. They carved it up the way they did so much of the world. And a young man, part African, part Indian, because the British had brought Africans there as slaves, but also had brought Indians from India as laborers.
Right.
And again, to create differences.
The Caribbean.
Yeah, to have the indigenous people suspicious about the Indians and suspicious about the Africans, with the European British sitting on the top and manipulating all of this. And Cheddi Jagan, who married a white American woman, who went down there, and the Indian man and the American woman, a radical American woman, went around and organized all of the communities. They had the Africans, they had the Indians, and they had the indigenous people. And they made a revolution, and they took over the government, and the British could do nothing about it. Very important story. And then the CIA and the British M5, they went to work and undid it all and brought in another leader who would do what Washington
is in the 60s?
wanted. Yeah, it was back. I remember the exact year. It was either the late 50s or the early 60s.
So this is in the same time the CIA is removing Arbenz in Guatemala.
Yeah, all of that.
They're assassinating Lumumba. They're laying waste across
all
the
of
globe.
it. Making sure, as they do to this day,
Right.
in the most grotesque ways in places like Haiti and Honduras, but also, Arbenz in Guatemala, all the succession of leaders in Brazil or Colombia. It was always the same. Periodically, something new would erupt. And the only remarkable thing about Cuba was that when they had their moment, Fidel, the United States couldn't
dislodge it.
stop it, and they've been bitter about it ever since. Look at the way they react to Chavez and Maduro. It's the same effort to reestablish the endless grinding poverty that capitalism has meant for Latin America for 300 years.
Where did Cheddi Jagan fit politically?
He was a socialist.
Right.
Interesting. His wife was an American leftist coming out of the American 1930s socialist communist milieu. Forget her name right now. No, he was a self-conscious. He had studied, I believe, in England. Like so many third world leaders, it was when they were students in the metropolitan country that they met metropolitan socialists and Marxists,
right,
and got these ideas and then began to make them relevant to their colonial situation. Ho Chi Minh did that. Many of the leaders of communist China did that.
What I love about Cabral is that then it cross-migrated back in his case, because he actually influenced the Portuguese, his colonial occupiers, but then he influenced the Carnation Revolution. They took his ideas, migrated it back to Portugal.
By the way, China is the same. If you look at the early leaders around Mao, they had been students in Germany, particularly, where they had encountered, Marxism, and all of French Africa. They encountered the Marxism of Paris and France, and so it's a very interesting cross-fertilization. And then later, now you can see it's coming back through the immigrant populations. Some of that filtered anti-capitalism resurfaces in the metropolitan countries. Very interesting, and it also shows you how dangerous it is to polarize that, as if there's a European that hasn't been shaped by the African, or vice versa. It really is much more homogenized than folks like to admit.
Well, isn't that a great answer? I mean, this is what I'm actually arguing in my book, that there's the Western chauvinist, bigoted, there's one continuous civilization from Athens to the America, this ridiculous nonsense, ahistorical, right-wing, exclusionary tradition. But then there's this, it's an understandable reaction, but it's also just as wrong, which is that, we're in these little micro communities and everybody has their distinct, and of course they're distinct, but there can't be any overlap, there can't be any solidarity. And then, of course, the reality that part of the rebuke to all of these racist narratives is that, in fact, like, Ancient Rome was African.
right.
Greek
Full of them.
philosophers were African in some cases. So actually, you always have this cross-pollination and migration having an internationalist, cosmopolitan flavor.
Also, there's this notion that the colonial experience, the French, the Germans, the British, the Dutch, as if it was all they controlled. Yeah, that's a delusion. They were also shaped by the people
Right.
they controlled in 1,000 ways, whether it is the rape of the local women, it is the interaction of the children, it is the impact of new cuisines, of new cultural forms, of new idea. It runs very complicated in all directions. Sorting that out as if you could neatly compartmentalize
Right.
the European from the not is an arrogance, but it's also ignorant. It didn't work like that. It's a delusion of a kind of master notion that never was true.
You've just watched a Michael Brooks show video, and you can watch all of our full main live shows every Tuesday night at around 7 p.m. Eastern Time, and subscribe to get all of the clips you want. We're covering the globe. We're focusing on international relations, the intellectual dark web. We're having fun. We're doing deep dives with a lot of amazing guests. Of course, become a patron for the whole thing at patreon.com/TMBS, or subscribe to this YouTube channel and help us keep growing and get that content out there. Subscribe below.